Welcome, seekers of truth, to the journey of inner transformation guided by the ancient philosophy of Stoicism. In the hustle and bustle of modern life, we often find ourselves entangled in the web of our own emotions, swayed by external circumstances beyond our control. But within the teachings of Stoicism lies a beacon of hope, a timeless wisdom that empowers us to navigate the storms of life with unwavering resilience and inner peace. Today, we embark on a voyage of self-discovery, exploring Stoic habits that will not only transform your daily routine but also awaken the dormant potential within you to rise above adversity and cultivate a life of virtue and fulfillment. As we delve into the depths of Stoic philosophy, let us heed the words of the ancient sages and draw inspiration from their timeless wisdom. 1. Embrace the power of perception. In the words of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them. At the heart of Stoicism lies the profound understanding that our perception shapes our reality. Instead of being enslaved by our immediate reactions to external events, we must cultivate the power of perception to see things as they truly are. Imagine a mighty oak tree standing tall amidst a raging storm. While the winds may howl and the branches may sway, the tree remains rooted in its strength and resilience. Similarly, by shifting our perspective and reframing our thoughts, we can weather the storms of life with calm and equanimity. 2. Cultivate inner strength through acceptance. Life is inherently unpredictable, filled with moments of joy and sorrow, triumph and defeat. Yet, within the core of our being lies a reservoir of inner strength waiting to be tapped. The Stoics teach us the importance of embracing the present moment and accepting things beyond our control. Reflect on the story of the Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who faced myriad challenges during his reign, yet remained steadfast in his commitment to virtue. Through the practice of acceptance, we can transcend the limitations of our circumstances and find peace amidst the chaos. 3. Practice the art of detachment. In a world consumed by materialism and instant gratification, the Stoics remind us of the fleeting nature of external possessions and accolades. True fulfillment lies not in the accumulation of wealth or status, but in the cultivation of inner virtue. Picture the image of a wise sage dwelling in a modest abode, content with the simple pleasures of life. By practicing the art of detachment, we free ourselves from the shackles of desire and find solace in the richness of our inner world. 4. Harness the power of resilience. Adversity is the crucible in which our character is forged. The Stoics teach us to embrace challenges as opportunities for growth and transformation. Instead of succumbing to despair in the face of hardship, we must cultivate resilience and fortitude. Consider the tale of the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who endured exile and persecution with unwavering courage. Through the practice of resilience, we can harness the power of our inner spirit to overcome even the most formidable obstacles. 5. Live in alignment with nature. At the heart of Stoic philosophy lies the concept of living in harmony with the natural order of the universe. Just as a river flows effortlessly downstream, so too must we align our actions with the rhythm of nature. Contemplate the majesty of the cosmos, with its infinite galaxies and celestial wonders. By attuning ourselves to the wisdom of nature, we gain a deeper understanding of our place in the universe and find meaning in the interconnectedness of all things. 6. Cultivate gratitude and virtue. In the pursuit of worldly success, it is easy to lose sight of life's simple blessings. The Stoics teach us to cultivate an attitude of gratitude and to cherish the virtues of humility, compassion, and integrity. Pause for a moment and reflect on the abundance that surrounds you, the warmth of the sun, the beauty of a blooming flower, the laughter of loved ones. By cultivating gratitude in our hearts, we awaken to the inherent richness of life and find fulfillment in the practice of virtue. 7. Embrace the impermanence of life. Life is but a fleeting moment, a precious gift to be cherished and savored. The Stoics remind us of the impermanence of all things and the inevitability of death. Instead of fearing the unknown, we must embrace the transience of life and live each day with purpose and intention. Contemplate the wisdom of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who taught that death is nothing to us, for when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist. By embracing the impermanence of life, we liberate ourselves from the fear of death and find peace in the eternal cycle of existence. 8. seek wisdom as your guiding light. In a world shrouded in darkness, wisdom serves as our guiding light, illuminating the path to inner truth and enlightenment. The Stoics urge us to seek wisdom with an insatiable thirst, to question the nature of reality and to embark on a lifelong journey of self-discovery. Draw inspiration from the wisdom of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who taught that only the educated are free. By cultivating wisdom in our hearts and minds, we break free from the chains of ignorance and find liberation in the pursuit of truth. As we journey through the labyrinth of life, let us heed the timeless wisdom of the Stoics and embrace the transformative power of Stoic habits. By cultivating the virtues of perception, acceptance, detachment, resilience, alignment with nature, gratitude, embracing impermanence, and seeking wisdom, we unlock the dormant potential within us to rise above adversity and cultivate a life of inner peace and fulfillment. In the words of the Stoic philosopher Seneca, true happiness is to enjoy the present, without anxious dependence upon the future. Let us seize the present moment with courage and conviction, knowing that within the depths of our souls lies the infinite capacity for growth and transformation. May the teachings of Stoicism serve as a guiding light on your journey towards self-mastery, and may you find solace in the timeless wisdom of the ancient sages. Remember, dear seeker, the power to transform your daily routine lies within you. Embrace it with an open heart and a steadfast resolve, for the path to Stoic mastery awaits those who dare to tread it. In crafting this video, I aim to capture the essence of Stoicism while weaving in compelling narratives and philosophical insights to captivate and inspire viewers on their journey of self-discovery. Through storytelling and reflection, I sought to evoke a deep sense of inner motivation and empowerment, urging viewers to embrace the transformative power of Stoic habits in their daily lives. In delving into the ancient philosophy of Stoicism, we are embarking on a journey into the depths of human resilience, wisdom, and fortitude. Stoicism, born in the streets of ancient Athens and honed in the crucible of Roman society, is not merely a set of principles, it's a way of life, a profound and transformative philosophy that teaches us to navigate the turbulent seas of existence with grace and dignity. As we embark on this odyssey of self-discovery, let us illuminate the path with the timeless wisdom of Stoic sages and the poignant tales of those who have walked it before us. In the annals of history, there exists a treasure trove of insights and anecdotes that serve as guiding lights, illuminating the way forward towards a life of virtue and tranquility. Let us begin with the first habit that will transform your daily routine, the practice of self-reflection. In the words of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, know, first, who you are, and then adorn yourself accordingly. This injunction to self-awareness is the cornerstone of Stoic practice, for it is only by knowing ourselves deeply and honestly that we can begin to cultivate the virtues that lead to a flourishing life. Self-reflection is not a passive endeavor, it requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to confront the shadowy recesses of our own souls. Yet, in the crucible of self-examination, we forge the tools of self-mastery, gaining insight into our own strengths and weaknesses, our desires and fears. Through this process, we learn to distinguish between that which is within our control and that which is not, freeing ourselves from the tyranny of external circumstances and empowering us to act with clarity and purpose. The second habit that will transform your daily routine is the cultivation of resilience in the face of adversity. In the words of the Stoic philosopher Seneca, we are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality. This admonition reminds us that our greatest battles are often fought not on the battlefield of external events, but within the confines of our own minds. Resilience is not the absence of suffering, but the capacity to endure it with grace and dignity. It is the ability to turn adversity into opportunity, to transform hardship into growth. In the face of life's inevitable trials and tribulations, we must cultivate the Stoic virtues of courage, perseverance, and resilience, drawing strength from within ourselves and from the collective wisdom of the ages. The third habit that will transform your daily routine is the practice of gratitude. In the words of the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, when you arise in the morning, think of what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love. This injunction to gratitude is a powerful antidote to the corrosive effects of entitlement and ingratitude. Gratitude is not merely a fleeting emotion, but a way of being in the world, a profound recognition of the interconnectedness of all things. It is a recognition that every moment, every breath, is a gift to be cherished and savored. In cultivating gratitude, we cultivate a deep sense of contentment and fulfillment, transcending the endless pursuit of external wealth and accolades in favor of a more meaningful and fulfilling existence. The fourth habit that will transform your daily routine is the cultivation of inner peace. In the words of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, he is a wise man who does not grieve for the things which he has not, but rejoices for those which he has. This admonition reminds us that true peace comes not from the accumulation of external possessions, but from the cultivation of inner tranquility. Inner peace is not a passive state, but an active practice, requiring discipline, mindfulness, and self-awareness. It is the ability to let go of attachment to outcomes, to accept the inherent uncertainty of life, and to find serenity amidst the storms of existence. In cultivating inner peace, we free ourselves from the shackles of desire and aversion, finding solace in the eternal verities of reason and virtue. The fifth habit that will transform your daily routine is the practice of compassion. In the words of the Stoic philosopher Seneca, wherever there is a human being, there is an opportunity for kindness. This injunction to compassion is a powerful reminder of our shared humanity, of the fundamental interconnectedness of all living beings. Compassion is not merely a sentiment, but a way of life, a profound recognition of the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. It is the ability to see beyond the surface appearances of others, to recognize their inherent goodness and potential for growth. In cultivating compassion, we cultivate a deep sense of empathy and understanding, transcending the narrow confines of ego and self-interest in favor of a more inclusive and compassionate way of being in the world. As we embark on this journey of self-discovery and transformation, let us remember the words of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus: "It is not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." In the crucible of life, we are called upon to cultivate the virtues of wisdom, courage, and resilience, to navigate the storms of existence with grace and dignity. Let us embrace the timeless wisdom of Stoicism, and let it guide us on our journey towards a life of meaning, purpose, and inner peace. To all those who have embarked on this journey with us, I implore you to engage with this content, not merely as passive observers, but as active participants in your own transformation. If these insights have resonated with you, if you have found value in the wisdom of Stoicism and the tales of resilience and virtue that have been shared, I encourage you to show your support by engaging with this video. Please, take a moment to hit the like button below, signaling your appreciation for the message conveyed. Your engagement serves as a beacon of encouragement, inspiring us to continue our exploration of Stoic philosophy and its profound implications for modern life. And if you haven't already done so, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, ensuring that you never miss out on future content that seeks to uplift and inspire. By subscribing, you become part of a community of like-minded individuals, united in our pursuit of wisdom, resilience, and inner peace. Together, let us continue to explore the depths of Stoic philosophy, drawing inspiration from the timeless wisdom of the ancients as we navigate the challenges of modern life. Thank you for your support, and may your journey towards self-mastery and virtue be filled with grace and fulfillment.